The fluorescent lights of the supermarket hummed overhead, casting a pale glow on crowded aisles overflowing with abundance. Shoppers pushed rattling carts, children begged for candy, employees called out for cleanups and price checks. It was the sound of everyday life, chaotic yet ordinary. But in the middle of all this noise, one quiet, almost invisible moment was unfolding, one that most people would never notice. At the baby formula section, a young mother stood completely still, frozen as if the world had stopped around her. Her sweater was loose against her thin frame, her tired eyes revealing nights without sleep. In her arms she cradled her baby, wrapped in a faded blanket that had clearly seen better days. At her side tugged a little girl no older than 5, her innocent voice softly asking, "Mommy, can we go home soon?" The mother's name was Emily. She reached for a can of baby milk, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it off the shelf. For a fleeting moment, hope sparked in her weary eyes. Maybe, just maybe, tonight her baby wouldn't cry from hunger. Maybe for once she wouldn't have to choose between food, rent, or heat. But as her gaze dropped to the price tag, that spark of hope died as quickly as it appeared. She opened her worn-out wallet. Inside were only a few crumpled bills, not nearly enough to cover the milk in her hand along with the other essentials she needed. Her breath caught in her throat. Her chest ached with a quiet despair only a struggling mother could know. And then, with heartbreaking reluctance, she put the can back on the shelf. It was such a small, simple act, just placing an item back where it belonged. But behind that gesture was the weight of an entire storm, a silent scream of sacrifice and survival. Her baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, and she pulled him closer to her chest as if shielding him not only from the cold, but from the harsh truth of their reality. Her daughter looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, not yet old enough to understand the meaning of what had just happened. All around them, people continued with their shopping, blind to this moment. To everyone else, it was just another day, another customer. But to Emily, it was another crushing reminder that she was fighting a battle no one else could see. And yet, what Emily didn't know was that someone had noticed. Emily's hands lingered on the cart handle as she slowly moved away from the baby formula aisle. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another shopper, another tired mother with 2 kids in tow. But beneath the surface, her world was collapsing one decision at a time. Every step down the aisle felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her entire life rested on her thin shoulders. She picked up a loaf of bread, but only after carefully choosing the cheapest option. She scanned the shelves of produce, her eyes searching for anything with a discount label, a few bruised apples, a bag of vegetables marked down for quick sale. She placed them into her basket, her movements deliberate, precise, and restrained. To an outsider, it was just grocery shopping. To Emily, it was a cruel math problem. How to stretch a handful of dollars to feed 3 mouths. Her little girl tugged at her sweater again, pointing to a box of cereal with bright cartoon characters smiling from the packaging. "Mommy, can we get this one?" the child asked with hopeful eyes. For a moment, Emily's heart ached. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to give her daughter something small, something sweet to make her feel like every other kid. But Emily's smile faltered. She shook her head gently. "Not today, sweetheart." Her daughter's shoulders slumped, but she didn't protest. Even at such a young age, she had learned the quiet language of sacrifice. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tightening. A mother was supposed to shield her children from hardship, not teach them how to accept it. As she walked further, Emily's mind drifted back to what life had been just a year ago. She had a husband then, a small but cozy home, and dreams of building a future filled with laughter and love. But tragedy came suddenly, like a storm without warning. Her husband's accident stole him away, leaving Emily not just with grief but with the crushing reality of raising 2 children alone. Since then, every day had been a battle. She worked nights at a diner, scrubbing dishes until her hands cracked, then spent mornings cleaning other people's homes for just enough to scrape by. Sleep was a luxury she rarely tasted. Bills stacked up like mountains she could never climb. And always there was the gnawing fear. Would tomorrow be the day she couldn't provide even the basics? Tonight was one of those nights. Even here, in a supermarket overflowing with abundance, Emily felt the sting of scarcity. She picked up a pack of diapers, her hand hesitating as she calculated what would be left after paying. For several seconds she debated silently with herself. The baby needed them, but the baby also needed milk, and her daughter needed food. How do you choose when every choice is wrong? She placed the diapers into her basket anyway, guilt clawing at her insides. Every decision felt like betrayal. If she bought this, she couldn't afford that. If she fed her baby tonight, what about the electricity bill tomorrow? By the time she reached the checkout line, Emily's anxiety was written all over her face. She pulled out her few crumpled bills and counted them twice, her fingers trembling. She forced a polite smile at the cashier, a silent apology for what might come if she couldn't cover the total. Her baby whimpered softly, and Emily hushed him. Whispering words of comfort meant more for herself than for him. Her eyes flickered once more to the baby formula aisle, just for a second. Longing, heartbreak, despair, all packed into a single glance. Then she lowered her gaze. The world didn't need to see her pain. She carried it silently with dignity, as though she could hide the storm raging inside her. But what Emily could not know was that in this very moment, someone else was watching. And for the first time in a long time, her invisible struggle was about to be seen. Jonathan had not planned to be there that afternoon. His schedule was a carefully constructed machine, every hour calculated for efficiency, profit, and progress. He was a man who built empires out of boardrooms, a man who wore wealth as naturally as others wore exhaustion. His black tailored suit whispered of success. His polished shoes carried him with practiced confidence. To him, the supermarket was a place he rarely entered. Assistants usually handled errands like this. But fate has a way of orchestrating moments that shatter routines, and today, all Jonathan needed was a bottle of water before his next meeting. He walked briskly through the aisles, his mind still occupied with numbers and negotiations, acquisitions and margins. But then, as he passed the baby formula section, he noticed her. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting image. A young mother standing still, staring at a can of baby milk. He could have looked away. He could have brushed it off as ordinary. After all, people struggled every day. That was the way of the world. But something about this scene refused to let him go. Jonathan slowed his stride. He watched as the woman's trembling hand reached for the can, lifted it, and then, after an agonizing pause, returned it to the shelf. He saw her shoulders sink, saw the weight pressing invisibly upon her frame. He saw the child tugging gently at her sweater, innocent and unaware of the silent heartbreak happening inches away. And then he noticed her baby, fragile, restless, wrapped in a worn blanket that spoke of days long past their softness. In that moment, the hum of the supermarket faded. The noise of rattling carts, the chatter of shoppers, even the voice in his head that always urged him to move faster, all of it vanished. There was only the sight of a mother quietly surrendering to poverty, the silent storm written across her face. Jonathan's chest tightened, a strange heaviness pressing against his ribs. For years he had conditioned himself to see the world as numbers, profits, and outcomes. Struggle, pain, desperation, these were statistics on a report, not moments lived in real time. He had donated to charities, sponsored events, even written checks that carried more zeros than most families earned in a year. But none of those acts had pierced his heart the way this one mother's small gesture did. Why? He asked himself. Why her? Why now? Perhaps it was the way she moved with dignity even in defeat. Perhaps it was the haunting flicker of longing in her eyes when she glanced one last time at the formula aisle. Or perhaps it was because, for the first time in a long time, Jonathan was not looking at poverty through the safe distance of headlines or reports. He was staring directly at it, human to human, and it stared back. He felt something stir inside him, something he had buried long ago beneath ambition and wealth. Compassion. Jonathan pretended to browse the candy rack near the checkout, but his attention remained locked on her. He watched her unload her few meager groceries. Bread, discounted vegetables, a pack of diapers she had clearly wrestled over before choosing. Every item felt like a decision carved out of sacrifice. He noticed how she counted her money twice, her lips tightening with each calculation. He noticed how she forced a polite smile to the cashier, as though apologizing for the insufficiency of her existence. The baby whimpered again. She hushed him, rocking gently, her voice low and soothing. The little girl clutched her sweater, gazing curiously at the world with wide, innocent eyes. Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. He remembered his own childhood then, The days before wealth, when his mother had stood in grocery aisles just like this, he remembered the fear in her eyes, the whispered prayers she thought no one heard. He had promised himself long ago he would never return to that life. And he hadn't. He had built walls of money so tall he thought nothing could penetrate them. But now here was this woman reminding him of everything he had tried to forget. The cashier bagged her items. She picked them up carefully as though each loaf of bread, each bruised apple carried more value than gold. She turned toward the exit, her children close at her side. Jonathan's mind raced. He could walk away. He could let her vanish into the blur of strangers. He could convince himself it wasn't his place, wasn't his problem, but he knew he wouldn't. For the first time in years, Jonathan's wealth felt meaningless unless it could bridge the gap he had just witnessed. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about philanthropy or reputation. This was about responsibility, the kind that comes not from contracts or deals, but from being human. He adjusted his tie, steadied his breath, and followed. Out of the supermarket, into the parking lot, where sunlight cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. Jonathan walked with purpose. His steps were steady, but his heart pounded with a new kind of urgency. Not the rush of closing a business deal, but the weight of a decision that could change not only her life, but his as well. Emily had no idea that someone had seen her, that her silent battle had not gone unnoticed. But Jonathan knew, and for once he understood that his next move would mean more than any deal he had ever signed. The supermarket doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and the afternoon light spilled across the parking lot. Emily stepped outside, balancing her crying baby in one arm and clutching her daughter's hand with the other. Her grocery bag dangled precariously from her wrist, its contents meager but precious. She walked slowly, her posture heavy with exhaustion, her eyes lowered as if the world outside were too harsh to meet directly. Jonathan followed a few paces behind, careful not to draw attention to himself. His polished shoes clicked softly against the pavement, a stark contrast to Emily's worn sneakers that scuffed with each step. For a man who had built a life on decisive action, he suddenly found himself paralyzed by uncertainty. How do you approach a stranger without frightening them? How do you offer help without making it feel like pity? His heart beat faster. He wasn't used to hesitation. In boardrooms, he commanded entire rooms with his words, closing deals worth millions with a single handshake. But here, facing a mother's quiet struggle, he felt powerless. Emily reached her car, an old sedan with faded paint and a cracked bumper. She opened the back door and guided her daughter inside, then set the groceries carefully on the passenger seat. Each movement carried a fragile dignity, as though she were handling treasures rather than discounted produce and diapers. Jonathan lingered a few steps away, watching as she shifted the baby in her arms, rocking him gently to quiet his cries. His throat tightened. He thought again of the moment inside, the trembling hand placing the can of formula back on the shelf. The image had seared itself into his mind like a brand. He couldn't walk away, not now. Yet he hesitated, rooted to the spot by the fear of being misunderstood. What if she rejected him? What if she thought his offer of help was an insult, or worse, a trap? He had seen enough of the world to know that trust was fragile, especially for someone who had already lost so much. Still, something stronger than doubt pushed him forward. Jonathan took a steady breath and approached. His footsteps echoed against the concrete, and Emily stiffened instantly, turning sharply to face him. Her eyes narrowed with instinctive caution, the kind born of living too long in a world that often took more than it gave. "I'm sorry," Jonathan began, his voice lower, gentler than he intended. He raised his hand slightly, a silent gesture to show he meant no harm. "I didn't mean to startle you." Emily adjusted her baby against her shoulder, shielding him instinctively. Her daughter peered curiously from the back seat, her wide eyes studying the stranger in the black suit. Jonathan paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound rehearsed or condescending. "I saw you inside, at the formula aisle." His voice faltered, uncharacteristically uncertain. I don't usually do this, but I couldn't walk away." Emily's jaw tightened. "I don't need charity," she said quickly, her tone defensive. Pride flickered in her eyes, fierce and protective. Jonathan nodded, absorbing her words without flinching. "I understand," he said softly. "This isn't about charity. It's about responsibility. Sometimes life puts us in places for a reason. and I think I was meant to see you today." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint cries of the baby and the distant sound of shopping carts rattling against the pavement. Emily shifted uneasily, torn between suspicion and exhaustion. She had been offered help before, and too often it came with strings attached. Jonathan reached into a small shopping bag he carried. He held it out slowly, careful not to push too close. Inside was the very can of baby formula she had set back on the shelf, along with a few extra groceries he had quietly purchased after her. Emily froze. Her eyes welled with tears she tried desperately to hold back. Her lips parted as if to protest again, but no words came. She looked at the bag, then at Jonathan, then back at her children. "It's not charity," Jonathan repeated, his voice steady now, conviction replacing hesitation. "It's kindness. And sometimes we all need a little kindness." Emily's hands trembled as she finally reached out. The bag was heavier than she expected, not just in weight but in meaning. Her tears spilled over, tracing silent lines down her cheeks. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing. He hadn't planned this moment, hadn't scripted it like one of his deals, yet it felt more important than any boardroom victory he had ever achieved. Emily whispered a quiet, broken, "Thank you," her pride bending but not breaking. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to accept help, not as defeat but as a fragile lifeline. Jonathan gave her a small, reassuring nod. "If you'll let me," he added carefully, "I'd like to do more. Not as a handout, but as a way of giving back. I've spent so long climbing ladders that I forgot what really matters. Today reminded me." Emily studied him, uncertainty etched across her face. But beneath it was something else, a flicker of hope. She didn't trust easily, couldn't afford to, but something in Jonathan's eyes, the sincerity, the absence of pity, made her pause. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, fate had led this stranger into her life for a reason. Emily stood frozen beside her car, her hands trembling as she clutched the grocery bag Jonathan had handed her. Inside it lay the can of formula she had been forced to abandon, along with fresh produce, bread, and other items she hadn't dared to place in her basket. It felt surreal, as if someone had quietly rewritten the ending of a painful chapter in her life. Her throat tightened. A wave of gratitude swelled within her, colliding with the fierce pride that had kept her standing through countless storms. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her chest. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like confessing to the world that she couldn't provide for her children. And yet, staring into Jonathan's steady gaze, she saw no judgment, no condescension, only sincerity. Jonathan, on the other hand, felt his own heart pounding in an unfamiliar rhythm. He had delivered presentations to CEOs, debated in front of investors, and negotiated contracts worth fortunes without hesitation. But this moment, standing before a fragile young mother with a child crying softly in her arms, felt more daunting than any boardroom. He had money, yes, but how do you offer dignity? How do you give hope without making someone feel small? "I know it's hard to accept," Jonathan said gently, sensing her inner battle. "I can't imagine the strength it takes to do what you're doing, but I don't want you to think of this as charity. Think of it as one human being helping another." Emily's daughter peered curiously from the back seat, her small face pressed against the glass. She watched her mother's hesitation, sensing the gravity of the moment though she couldn't understand its weight. For her, the bag of food wasn't complicated. It simply meant there would be dinner tonight. The baby stirred again, whimpering softly. Emily held him tighter, her eyes filling with tears she could no longer fight back. A sob escaped her lips before she could stop it. She covered her mouth with one hand, ashamed of breaking down in front of a stranger. Jonathan's chest ached. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he stayed rooted in place, afraid of crossing the invisible boundary between them. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "No one should have to." Emily finally whispered, "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Jonathan inhaled slowly. For once, he didn't have a calculated answer. "Because I saw something I couldn't ignore," he said. "Because sometimes the world gives us chances to step in, and if we don't, we lose a part of ourselves." Her defenses wavered. His words didn't sound rehearsed or polished like a salesman's pitch. They sounded raw, genuine, and in his eyes she didn't see pity, She saw compassion. Still, the instinct to protect herself lingered. I can't repay you, she said softly, almost apologetically. Jonathan shook his head. I'm not asking for repayment. All I ask is that one day, when you can, you pass it forward. That's enough. The silence stretched again, filled with the gentle rustle of wind across the lot. Emily glanced at her children, at the bag in her hands, at the stranger standing before her with patience in his eyes. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Jonathan exhaled with relief, a small smile tugging at his lips. He had seen empires rise and fall, fortunes gained and lost, but nothing had ever felt as meaningful as hearing those two words spoken through tears. Yet for him, this wasn't enough. A bag of groceries could ease tonight's hunger. But what about tomorrow? What about the countless nights that stretched ahead, each filled with the same impossible math Emily had been forced to solve? He wanted to do more. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of an awakening he hadn't felt in years. Emily, he said carefully, using her name for the first time. She looked up, surprised that he knew it. He pointed gently to the name stitched on her daughter's small backpack lying on the car seat. She flushed with embarrassment, realizing how he'd learned it. I don't want to intrude, Jonathan continued. But if you're willing, I'd like to help beyond this. Not as charity, but as opportunity. You deserve a fair chance. Your children deserve it. Her eyes widened, a mix of suspicion and disbelief. Offers of help often carried hidden costs. She had learned that the hard way. But Jonathan's tone carried no threat, no strings. Only possibility. She hesitated. What do you mean? Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. His fingers shook slightly, betraying the emotions he tried to mask. This is my number, he said. If you're ever ready, call me. I can help with childcare, with work, whatever you need to get back on your feet. I can open doors, but the choice is yours. No pressure, no obligation. Emily stared at the card as if it were a foreign object. Part of her wanted to crumple it and throw it away. Another part of her, the part that had been carrying an unbearable weight alone, wanted to clutch it to her chest and never let go. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. That small contact sent a strange warmth through her, one she hadn't felt in a long time. The warmth of being seen, truly seen. Thank you, she whispered again, this time steadier. Jonathan nodded. Take care of your little ones. That's all that matters. With that, he stepped back, giving her space. Emily placed the bag gently in the car, buckled her baby into his worn car seat, and settled behind the wheel. She looked at the card once more before tucking it carefully into her wallet, as though it were fragile and precious. As she pulled away, Jonathan stood watching, the sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. His chest felt heavy, but not with regret, with purpose. He had just taken the first step into something he couldn't yet define, but he knew it mattered more than any deal waiting on his desk. For Emily, the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in months, she carried with her more than groceries. She carried the faint glimmer of hope. And for Jonathan, the man who had built his life chasing wealth, he discovered in that moment a truth he had long forgotten. The richest moments are not measured in profits, but in people. The days that followed were not magically easy, but they were different. For the first time in months, Emily's nights weren't filled with the same relentless dread. She fed her baby without the gnawing fear that tomorrow would bring nothing. She smiled more often at her daughter, who laughed when she saw her mother's relief. The storm clouds that had hovered over their small world began to thin, letting in streaks of light. Jonathan had not forgotten either. He was a man accustomed to moving on quickly, always chasing the next deal, but something about Emily's quiet strength stayed with him. Her face, lined not with age but with exhaustion, haunted him more than any balance sheet. And so a few days later he reached out. His call was cautious, his voice gentle. Emily, it's Jonathan. I just wanted to check in. How are you doing? The conversation was brief, almost awkward at first. Emily was wary, her pride still resisting the idea of accepting help. But slowly, as she realized he was genuine, her guard began to lower. Within a week, Jonathan arranged childcare assistance through a program he funded quietly. ensuring Emily could work more consistently without worrying about leaving her children alone. The impact was immediate. Emily secured steadier hours at the diner, and soon after, Jonathan introduced her to an opening at one of his companies. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable, with better pay and benefits she had never imagined having. Emily hesitated at first, unsure if she could belong in a world that felt so far from her own. But Jonathan reassured her, "You've already proven your strength. This is just giving you the ground to stand on." Step by step, her life began to shift. With stable income, she moved into a safer apartment, one with enough space for her children to play without fear of broken glass on the floor or leaking pipes overhead. Her daughter began to smile more freely, no longer carrying the unspoken weight of adult worries on small shoulders. Her baby grew stronger, his cries less desperate, his tiny body nourished by formula. Emily no longer feared she couldn't afford. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was within Emily herself. For so long she had lived in survival mode, eyes lowered, shoulders hunched, spirit worn thin. Now she began to lift her head. She began to dream again. She thought about saving, about maybe one day finishing the classes she had abandoned when life fell apart. She thought about giving her children more than survival. She thought about giving them a future, and Jonathan, he too was changing. For years, his life had been defined by acquisitions, deals, and the constant pursuit of more. Success had been his compass, but it had left him hollow. Now, visiting Emily's modest new home, sitting on her porch while her daughter giggled in the yard, he felt something he hadn't known he was missing: peace. He played with the little girl, who quickly grew fond of him, her innocent laughter piercing the walls he had built around himself. He watched Emily, her resilience shining even in simple acts like cooking dinner or folding laundry. There was no extravagance in her life, yet there was a richness he envied, a strength born not from wealth, but from enduring and still choosing love. Jonathan realized he had been given much in life, but until now he had never truly given himself. Not just money, not just resources, but time, presence, compassion, and in doing so, he discovered a wealth greater than all the riches he had amassed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with shades of orange and gold, Jonathan sat quietly on Emily's porch. She rocked her baby gently, humming a soft lullaby. Her daughter played with chalk on the steps, drawing crooked hearts and stick figures that made her giggle. Jonathan felt something stir deep within him. He had closed countless deals, but none had ever left him with this sense of fulfillment. He realized then that true success wasn't about the size of his bank account, but the size of his impact on someone else's life. Emily glanced up at him, her eyes softer than they had been in the supermarket that day. For the first time, she didn't look weighed down by despair. She looked hopeful. And in that moment, Jonathan knew. The act of kindness that began with a can of formula had grown into something far greater. It had transformed not just Emily's life, but his own. The air was warm that evening, heavy with the scent of fresh grass and the fading glow of the sun. On the small porch of her modest new home, Emily rocked her baby gently, humming the same lullaby her mother once sang to her. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, his breath slowing as sleep took hold. Her daughter sat nearby, chalk dust on her hands, proudly showing Jonathan the uneven shapes she had drawn on the wooden steps: hearts, stars, and a family with 3 smiling faces. For Emily, the world felt unrecognizably different from the night in the supermarket. She still carried her scars, the weight of her loss and the memory of endless nights of fear. But now, woven between those memories, was something she had thought she'd lost forever: hope. She no longer lived every day with the gnawing panic of wondering how she would feed her children. She could breathe. She could look forward. She could believe in tomorrow. Jonathan sat quietly, his usual sharp composure softened by the golden light of dusk. He watched Emily, her quiet strength radiating in the simple act of holding her child. He watched her daughter giggle as she smeared chalk across her cheeks like war paint. And he realized, with a clarity sharper than any business triumph, that this was the wealth he had been chasing without knowing it. He had measured his success for years in contracts signed, profits earned, and accolades won. But none of those moments had filled the hollowness inside him. What filled it now was not numbers but connection, not money but meaning. He hadn't just changed Emily's life. Emily and her children had changed his. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jonathan felt gratitude, a kind he had never experienced. Gratitude that fate had placed him in that supermarket aisle. Gratitude that he had chosen not to walk away. Gratitude that a single act of kindness had multiplied into something far greater than himself. Emily looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the glow of the setting sun. "You didn't just help me," she whispered. "You gave me my life back." Jonathan's throat tightened, but he only nodded. Because he knew the truth. She had given him something too, a chance to feel human again, to remember that kindness is the only wealth that multiplies when shared. And now, dear listener, the story is no longer just about Emily or Jonathan. It is about you. How many Emilys walk past us every day, their silent battles unseen, their struggles invisible in the rush of our own lives? How many chances have we been given to step in to make a difference, but walked away because we thought it wasn't our place? What if kindness isn't about grand gestures? What if it's as simple as noticing, as reaching out, as refusing to let someone fight alone? Jonathan's story began with a trembling hand setting back a can of baby milk. Yours could begin anywhere. A bus stop, a classroom, a cafe, or even in your own home. The smallest act of compassion can ripple outward, changing not just one life, but two, sometimes even more. So I ask you now, what is one act of kindness you will never forget, either given or received? Share it, tell it, because stories like Emily's are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to inspire. Kindness costs nothing, but its impact can be everything. And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one choice, one act of courage to change the course of someone's life forever. Will you be ready when your moment comes?